Have I had questions along the way? Yes. Some very serious questions, and you have to settle a question after debating it. You don't settle it before debating it. You go through. I've read authors, I talk to others, I check this out against with other people's thinking and so forth. When I bring these points of convergence, I find the Christian truth to meet two tests of logic: correspondence theory, coherence theory. Individual assertions correspond to reality. The whole system teaching put together brings a coherent worldview. That's the way I see that. Then in life itself, the twin realities of truth and relevance. I find it very relevant in my life every day. My decisions are not made ad hoc. They're made on the basis of a prior commitment that life at its core is sacred. So to answer your question, yes, you will always have questions. You'll always struggle with questions. But as C.S. Lewis would say, you don't go all the way back to the beginning. You take one or two steps back to see how you deal with that question before you start moving forward. So personally, the doubt has never been a factor, but the question has. Now, I know some people who wrestle with great doubts, and with great sympathy help them and deal with them because they're trying to struggle mainly with the intellectual component of their faith. Or sometimes experientially they've gone through a lot of suffering, a lot of pain, and they just cannot put this whole story together in the light of the gospel. So you have to deal with the convergence of these points of reference, and at times where the intellectual may be weak, the experiential does carry you through till the intellect catches up with what you are living with and going through. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks for that question. The Bible says to be merciful to those who doubt. And when I came to Princeton, I didn't come as a Christian, grew up in a sort of culturally Catholic home, wasn't sure what I believed about God. And I think as I started to think through Christianity seriously for the first time, one of my concerns was that if I became a Christian, it would be a sort of intellectual dictatorship, and there wouldn't be any room for doubt, there wouldn't be any room for questions. I'd be told in detail what I need to believe on every fine point of doctrine. And I've been really pleased to find that that's not the case, that we are to be merciful to those who doubt, that there are lots of rooms for questions, and there's much more disagreement on things within the Christian tradition than there is agreement. There's agreement on core things about who Jesus claimed to be, about the death that he died, that he rose from the dead. But there's a lot of room for disagreement. My own personal story is that I played soccer here at Princeton. Two guys who were a year older than me on the soccer team, they were involved in a ministry called Athletes in Action. They invited me along. I saw an integrity, a strength of character in the community that I began to observe. I started to ask difficult questions. I started to read the New Testament as I was challenged to do for the first time. I'd argue my way through it, and I was crossing things out and writing my own versions. I'd write BS in the margins when I disagreed with something, and Christians would sort of look over my shoulder and say, "Hey, why do you have a BS in the margin of your Bible?" I'd say, "Oh, that verse makes for a great Bible study." I was studying philosophy at the time. It was very important to me for Christianity to be intellectually credible and defensible. I began to look into some of the arguments for the Christian faith, for the resurrection, from science, for different things. I found myself very compelled by them, but there were still doubts. And for me, not everyone has a specific moment. For me, I actually did have a sort of moment where I think my heart was just ready to say, actually, God, if you're really there, I'm ready to follow you in full. And I think when God knew that my heart was in that place, the sort of probabilities that I had calculated, but which retained the doubts, did go away to a certain extent. And for me, this is just an analogy that is helpful for me. I think believing in God and trusting God is something like knowing someone's face. You know, I could write out for you different things about someone's face, the shape of their nose, the shape of their eyes. I could write that out for you propositionally. I could try to make an argument about that with sentences, but I would never be able to exhaust what there is to know about a person's face. To do that, I'd have to just look at you and see your face and know your face. And what I find in my life is that when doubts creep in more significantly in terms of my belief in God and my trust in God, it's often because I've stepped away from actually being in that personal relationship with God face to face, and I'm doing more of the writing down on the paper. I'm doing more of the calculating, more of the abstract thinking, intellectual argumentation. And it's during those times that I find being able to read the Bible, to be in community with other believers, or just to be able to serve other people, just to sort of ask God to come alongside me as I serve others. Those are the sorts of things I can do that just puts me face to face to God, and then I know him, I know his face in a way that I don't if I'm just trying to write it down or intellectualize it. I hope that helps a bit.
Thank you. I'm very grateful to be here and feel that I was led here today. It was very unexpected. I was wondering about theism versus deism. Bishop Jack Spong of the Episcopal Church has rejected theism, says that it's dead, and claims in his deistic view, which is shared by many in the church today, that God is love and the ground of being, but perceives personal prayer as alien. And I wondered if you could talk about the personal God. To me, some of deism sounds like atheism with the word deist put on it. And I wondered if you could share your views on that.
The question is about relationship between deism and, say, Christian faith. Deism being the belief that there's a God of some sort, a cause of some sort that started things going, but maybe doesn't have the sort of personal interaction that the Christian God is claimed to have in the world. And this is something where I'd want to say that the Christian faith is very much on the opposite end of the spectrum. Okay, a God who not only created the world and started the world in the first place, but is intimately involved in each person's life. And this is a radical idea. In the Old Testament, you have for the first time the idea of a marriage metaphor to explain the relationship between God and the people that God has created. Okay, other ancient Near Eastern myths knew of the idea of gods having other divine lovers, but the idea of a God who loved finite, imperfect human persons is radically unique in the Old Testament and then moving into the New Testament, and we see that ultimately fulfilled in God actually coming to earth, the Christian story being that God actually came to earth and lived a human life that he didn't have to live, suffered a human death that he didn't have to suffer in order to be intimately involved in our lives. So I'd want to say that deism is on the different side of the spectrum from the Christian faith, and that's because the sort of intimacy and the sort of interaction that Christianity is claiming that God has in our lives is very intimate and very personal. I don't know if you'd like to add to that.
You know, it's interesting how people in the early part of this century started to move away from the word religion. They didn't like religion. I hear people saying, I don't like religion, I'm into spirituality. And I've written a book that I hope, if you're interested in the whole New Age spiritual movement, it was called Why Jesus? And I traced the roots back of spirituality all the way to its Greek heritage and so on, and the pantheistic worldview of India and so forth. And if you read Elizabeth Lesser, who's sort of the guru of this New Age spirituality, the more I read them, I came to this incredible conclusion. The difference between atheism and the new spirituality is in the process that they end up with the same conclusion. The process is different, the conclusion is the same. In atheism, there is no God. In the new spirituality also, there is no God out there. You're the divine one. You're the God. So it basically gives you that same privilege that atheism gave you, except it dressed it up in all kinds of spiritual talk. I think what Vince has said is critical, that in the Judeo-Christian worldview that we talk about, it is not viewed as an ideational connection. It's not viewed, for example, in the whole New Age or the movement of meditation, where if you stare inwards for long enough with the right mantra or the right knowledge or the right devotion, you ultimately find you are one with this impersonal absolute and get absorbed into this impersonal divine entity, which is not a personal being. That's not what the goal is in the Christian faith. In the Christian faith, the relationship notion is so rich and so true that truly you have the relationship with the living God in prayer, in the knowledge of love, in the whole concept of the fact that you actually are not in union with the divine, you're in communion and in communication. And that relationship issue is very unique and very distinctive, and the gospel lends itself to it. So you're right, theism in broad terms or pantheism may end up just being ideational relationships to abstract theories, but in the Christian faith your relationship is to a personal moral first cause, and that's why the accountability is therefore just as real.
Thank you. My question is a different perspective on the first subject of the question, which was belief versus doubt. You mentioned that you have no problem with doubt now, but it struck me that during your entire talk, you gave reasons for belief which were instrumental in the sense that this are the good things that would happen if you believe. And I did not hear any reasons for believing that this is true. And I think there's a big difference between reasons to believe a truth versus reasons to believe that good things might come if you believe this, whether or not it's true. And along the same lines, it also struck me that you passed over what I would consider to be the strongest evidence that there is no God, which is evil. If I would see a death camp, rather than think that that's a reason to believe in God, I would think that's a reason not to believe in God. And I'd appreciate your response.
I appreciate your candor very, very much. And yes, I think that's probably, it's oftentimes they say virtue in distress and vice in triumph has made atheists of mankind, that you see this kind of evil and this kind of suffering. But let me go back to your first comment, which was an important one, that I didn't present any reasons to believe in God. I just presented reasons why I'm not an atheist. I was trying to stay with the subject matter that is given to me. In fact, tomorrow night you're welcome to where I'm going to be. I'm going to present my defense of Christianity, and maybe they'll tell you where that will be, and I will give you the reasons very clearly there. But for now, let me just give you maybe 2 or 3 of them that I think will enable me to at least get past the hurdle. The question you've raised is germane to one of my own arguments in the beginning. If evil is real and not a construct in our own mind, and evil is truly something to be shunned and is morally deviant, then there is no way to sustain that without a moral being who's the creator of this universe. And let me give that in 2 illustrations for you. See, when a person says there's such a thing as evil, they assume there's such a thing as good. When they assume there's such a thing as good, they're assuming there's such a thing as a moral law on the basis of which to differentiate between good and evil. But when they assume there's such a thing as a moral law on the basis of which to differentiate between good and evil, they have to posit a moral lawgiver, but that's whom they're trying to disprove and not prove. Because if there's no moral lawgiver, there's no moral law. If there's no moral law, there's no good. If there's no good, there's no evil. What becomes really of the question? So here's what I want to say to you. Out of these 4 steps, from evil to good to the moral law to the moral lawgiver, the one that you could really quibble with and say, Ravi, why do I have to come up with a moral lawgiver in order to sustain a moral law or to go to good and go to evil? And the reason is this: whenever a question of evil is raised, it is either raised by a person or about a person. It is either raised by a person or about a person, which assumes, therefore, persons have intrinsic worth. And that is not a legitimate offspring ideationally of a non-theistic universe. How does one give essential worth to a product of time plus matter plus chance? So when you assume that there is implicit worth in personhood, you're actually assuming that the person is a created being by one of intrinsic and implicit worth. Now, if you go, for example, to the pantheistic worldview, all is God, God is all, you are part of the pantheistic worldview in the cycle of birth and rebirth. If you come, for example, to the Islamic worldview and you talk about God, God is so distant that you cannot really truly make too many propositional statements about him. The distance is so great between the sovereign God and the finite human. A person came to Jesus and he said to Jesus, is it all right to pay taxes to Caesar? I've just filed my taxes 3 days ago, and I wish Jesus had answered this question differently. Because at the same time, it'd be wonderful to be both godly and rebellious, you know. But Jesus looked at him and said, "Do you have a coin?" And the man said, "Yes." He said, "Show it to me." So Jesus took the coin and said, "Whose image do you see on this coin?" The man said, "Caesar." Jesus says, "Give to Caesar that which belongs to Caesar, and give to God that which belongs to God." The man ought to have had a follow-up question. The follow-up question should have been, "What belongs to God?" Jesus would have said to him, "Whose image is on you?" This intrinsic worth that Jesus gives to you and me, sir, is an undeniable expression of my starting point, that my questions are valuable because at core my essence is valuable. And when I see a deviation from it, I have a legitimate reason to ask that question. The problem of evil is delegitimized in a naturalistic framework. That's why Richard Dawkins, although Peter Singer here takes issue with Richard Dawkins, but Richard Dawkins' comment is fascinating. He said, "I have to come to the conclusion that there is no such thing as evil. We are merely dancing to our DNA." Dawkins is being more consistent. He says that if I assume the reality of evil, I have to posit a transcendent basis on which to measure it. So I can't afford to accept the reality of evil. So I say to you, the question of evil and moral reasoning points me to a transcendent moral lawgiver. And if I take the offer on the cross for forgiveness and grace, which is what we all desperately need, without which we won't make it, and the theory of Jesus' resurrection from the dead, the Christian worldview presents to me a coherence of intrinsic worth and the resultant way in which we live, loving God and loving our fellow human being. 613 laws were given to Moses. David reduced it to 15. Isaiah to 11. Micah to 3. When Jesus was asked which is the greatest law, he didn't reduce it to 1. He said to love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your strength and all your mind, and to love your neighbor as yourself. He said on these two commandments hang all of the law and the prophets. Because of the first, the second follows. Without the first, the second doesn't follow at all. It's with its feet firmly planted in midair. So the existential ramifications of knowing God and the intrinsic worth of my neighbor and my own life gives me the defense of theism much more than atheism can defend these two very issues. So I will give you a more lengthy answer on this if you come tomorrow, but I think implicit in the not of atheism is the yes of theism, how it gives me meaning, gives me hope, gives me the recovery, and more than anything else describes my intrinsic worth and what it means to be human. Thank you.
I might just add a couple of points, because this question of the evidence was so significant for me as I came to take Christianity seriously for the first time. And I think my initial assumption was that the burden of proof was much higher for theism or Christianity than it would be, say, for atheism, because Christianity was claiming all of these crazy miracles and atheism was just a sort of more purely scientific, rational way of seeing things. So I began to think about it more. I asked the question, okay, what are the sort of big picture possible explanations for the universe that we live in? And there's really only 3 logical possibilities. 1, God created it. And now, admittedly, that's a weird option. Possibility number 2, it just popped into existence from nothing without any explanation at all. Now, again, that's a weird option. Possibility number 3, the universe has existed infinitely back in time, but without any explanation for why it's done so. Then maybe you can explain each portion of the universe by some portion that came before it, but you still have absolutely no explanation for why there's a universe at all. My point is, each one of those possibilities is supernatural in an informal use of the term. Okay, they exhaust the relevant alternatives, and every one of them is remarkable. And it made me realize, actually, no matter what your position, we live in a miraculous world. And so that opened me up to the possibility of maybe miracles being part of the worldview that I would accept. And for me, the most significant of those miracles was the resurrection. I'll just read you a real short passage here. This is in 1 Corinthians. And this is Paul writing, the Apostle Paul. And he says, "For I handed on to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the 3rd day in accordance with the Scriptures, that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 brothers at once, most of whom are still living, almost as if to say, go out and ask them if you like, though some have fallen asleep. After that, he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Last of all, he appeared to me. The amazing thing about this passage is that in recent scholarship, it's become a consensus, more or less, that that passage dates back to within the first couple of years of Jesus' death. You go back 100 years from now, and if you brought out a passage like that, most people would have said, oh, it's legendary development. Okay, it didn't start out that way, the story, but you sort of play that game where I tell you something, you tell the next guy, he tells the next guy, and by the time it gets into the book, it's developed as a myth. The scholarship now, for various reasons, having to do with that passage, the poetic rhythm of the passage, the words that are used to introduce it, the times that we know Paul spent with Peter just after the resurrection. Even the most liberal scholars on the question, Gerd Ludemann, Robert Funk, people who are involved in the Jesus Seminar who are radically skeptical about claims of Christianity, admit that this passage dates back to within a couple of years of the resurrection. So here's the situation that we're in. Christianity Part 1, the apostles believe that Jesus is going to be the Messiah. He's going to be this earthly king who's going to restore the Davidic throne. Then Christianity Part 3, there's this eruption of Christianity. And in the middle, all we have is Jesus' death. And what's the explanation for how we get from Christianity Part 1 to the passage that I just read you, where we know that shortly after Jesus' death, the disciples are utterly convinced that they have seen with their own eyes Jesus raised from the dead. There's a huge historical gap there. Christians fill that gap with the resurrection. If you don't fill that gap with the resurrection, the thing is that the gap still remains. And in my reasoning and in my thinking about this, the resurrection has been the only plausible alternative for how you fill that huge historical gap. In 2003, Richard Swinburne, he was the head philosopher of religion at Oxford. He wrote a book, it's called The Resurrection of God Incarnate. And in that book, he argues that based on the available evidence today, the probability of Jesus having literally, physically risen from the dead is 97%. Now, he says you can't take the number seriously. He likes to work with probability theory. He plugs in guesstimates at the different points in the argument. But nevertheless, the fact that someone of his intellectual caliber can write that, make that argument in print, have it be published by Oxford University Press, and ably defend it at top-flight academic conferences around the world, and I've seen him do that. Okay, it shows that the intellectual case for Christianity is credible. And when I came to realize that, it caused me to ask the question, okay, is it really intellectual doubts that are keeping me from the Christian faith, or is it something that has more to do with my heart than with my mind? Those are a couple points.
Hey, so I had a question on the problem of evil from the Christian worldview. I like how you mentioned, Ravi, that you need a transcendent anger before you can pose the problem of evil. And it was good to hear, Dr. Vitale, that you did some work on this yourself. So in Christian philosophy, I believe that Alvin Plantinga has given a good defense with his free will defense of moral evil. But is there a good response to what seems to be natural evil that is apart from the moral decisions free creatures make? So if you guys could talk about that and explain the best way to deal with that, because I think that's it's an issue a lot of Christians wrestle with. So, yeah.
That's great. Thank you for that question. I think you're right. I mean, the Christian story says that the world is not the way the world's supposed to be, and the world's not the way that it's going to be in the end. Okay, that we're living, in a sense, in a broken world. But especially with respect to natural evil, that still raises the question of why would God allow the world to continue the way it is, even if it's the case that free will at some point made the world broken in the way that it is. Let me just give one potential way to think about this, just one area to open up. I mean, I don't think that this is a question that we should expect a full response to. If I need to take my dog Buster to the vet to give him a needle so he doesn't get a terrible disease, Okay, he doesn't understand why he has to experience the pain of that needle. And when I sit Buster down on the couch and I try to explain to him that this is important so he doesn't get a terrible disease, okay, I don't get very far. Okay, and that's not because of some lack of ability on my part. It's not that I'm not a good enough communicator to get through to him. It's just that he's not the sort of being that can understand why I do many of the things that I do. And I think similarly, if it's true as the Christian faith claims that God is far beyond us in intellectual capability and understanding, then we shouldn't expect to be able to see all of his reasons for allowing the suffering that he does. Oftentimes, we get to a certain point in our life and we look back and we can understand some of the suffering, but then some of the other suffering just seems pointless, it seems horrendous, you just can't fathom how God would allow it. I think that's a natural place to be in, and I think that that's okay. But here's one just further thing to think further about. We sometimes think of the problem of evil or the problem of suffering like this. We picture ourselves in this world, then we picture ourselves in a different world with far less suffering, and we say, surely God should have created me in that world rather than in this world, in the world with less suffering rather than the world with lots of suffering. That's a reasonable thought. I think it's a thought that relies on a philosophical mistake. Okay, it relies on the assumption that it would still be you who would exist if the world looked very different, and in fact was that world with far less suffering rather than this world and its suffering. And I think that's actually not the case. There was an important moment in my parents' dating life when they were first dating. They're actually here tonight. And there was an important moment where on their second date, my dad noticed a ring on my mom's finger. And so he asked about it. And she said, oh, yeah, well, that's just a ring that one of my old boyfriends gave to me. I just wear it because I think it looks nice. And they were standing on a bridge at the time overlooking the sort of picturesque New York City skyline. And my dad said, oh, yeah, it is nice. Let me see it. Most people don't get it at that point. You're quicker than most Princeton. So my mom took it off, handed it to my dad, and my dad, he threw it off the bridge, and he watched it sink to the bottom of the Hudson River. Now, my mom loved it. Okay, I think that was like the clinching moment. But my question is this. What if my mom didn't love it, okay? What if she ran back to the old boyfriend instead? What would that have meant for me? Okay, now I might be tempted to think, oh, that could have been better off for me. Maybe I would have been taller. Maybe I would have been better looking. You know, maybe my soccer career would have went further. I would have been more athletic. That would be a wrong way to think about things. If my mom had married the other guy rather than my dad, it wouldn't have been me that came to exist. Maybe some other kid would have come to exist, and maybe that other kid would have been more athletic or taller or better looking, but it wouldn't have been me. So here's my question. What if one of the things that God values about this world is your existence as the individual that you are? Okay, the Bible says that God chose you individually before the creation of the world. What if that's true? And what if one of the things he values about this world is your existence? What would the world have had to look like in order for you, as the individual that you are, to come to exist and for him to call you into relationship with himself for all eternity? And I think the answer is that actually he would have had to allow it to go down a course where it looked quite similar to the way that it actually does. That's at least something to think further about.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Thank you for speaking, first of all. My question for you is, you say that heartless, egregious acts like the Holocaust are brought about by people without a moral reference point in God. But how do you explain all the death and destruction that has been done in a God's name, such as the Crusades, the Inquisition, suicide bombings, or Christianizing the quote-unquote savage?
Yeah, great question. And I appreciate you asking that. The base of the question doesn't change, that whatever was done by A or B were both dastardly things. They ought not to have been done. That's the assumption we both make here, whether it was done in the name of atheism or whether it was done in the name of religion. People often say that religion has been so divisive, religion has been so horrible and so much of evil in this world, and it has its share to face. But let me just say that you go back across history, and when Nietzsche penned his madman parable, he made this comment. He said, if God is dead in this 19th century, philosophically, the 20th century will become the bloodiest century in history. And he said a universal madness will break out. And in the 20th century, we killed more people in warfare than all of the previous 19 centuries put together. All right? Now, and Nietzsche, ironically, took the first step himself. The last 13 years of his life, he spent insane, just in a world of his own, and every now and then quoting the scripture when he broke his silence. If you take statistically what happened under Mao, what happened under Stalin, what happened under Pol Pot, the 130 to 150 million killed just between these three, it pales any other tragedy of any other worldview that has been committed, religious or otherwise, across the centuries. So first of all, the numbers game is not what atheists sometimes make it out to be. The numbers are huge. I'm going to be in Shanghai within a couple of weeks. I'll be there 3 weeks from now. And I remember being in Nanjing, where I saw the seminary that Mao Zedong had burned, and talked to them and the 60-some million that he killed. When he burned the seminary, he said, God is going to be evicted from this land, never to be brought back here again. The fastest growing church in the world today is in China. It's absolutely amazing. It's the fastest growing church in the world today, somewhere between 50 to 100 million. When crusades and all took place, the religious people calling themselves Christians made the biggest blunder you ever make with your faith in God, and that's the politicization of religion. That became a state church, a politicized church, as some of it still is. And that's why in Europe today, where you see the state church, you see the resistance towards that kind of teaching. It was kind of setting up a theocracy when it was actually more a theonomy, where enforcing the laws of God on people supposedly, but the hierarchy was in the hands of men. When you look at the Christian worldview in quotes that did this, you knew they were violating the fundamentals of their very Christian faith. So it was a deviation from what they claimed to believe. When you see violence in the atheistic worldview, it's very much in keeping with the assumptions that we are pragmatically going to be our own God and make our own destiny. So you never ever judge a philosophy by its abuse. Never ever judge a philosophy by its abuse. You take a look at the philosophy in its logical outworkings. Now, this is where I sometimes have discussions with my Muslim friends on this issue of suicide bombing and what's happening in parts of the Middle East today, in the warfare that's going on. That is, of course, a completely different religious worldview to what the Christian faith is all about. We must understand this. All religions don't believe the same things. You well know, probably come from the same part of the world as I do, that you know how different these assumptions are. So let me give you a conversation that I had with Sheikh Talal, who's one of the founders of Hamas. The Archbishop of Canterbury took me and 4 other men to meet with the leaders on both sides of all the conflict that was going on. And we were Sheikh Talal as one of the founders of Hamas. We'd met with all of the leaders, one after another. It was a tough, tough week. My mind was exhausted by the time I'd finished listening to both sides on this. Last day we were in Ramallah. And Sheikh Talal has hosted us for a big meal, and Yasser Arafat's men, and all of them in the room, smoke-filled room, big meal. It's over. The Archbishop was the lead man, so he carried on the conversation. Then he looked at the 5 of us. He said, I give you men each a chance to ask one question. I won't tell you what question I asked Sheikh Talal, but it is along the vein that you've just raised. That's all I'll say to you. And I didn't like his answer. I didn't like it. He's a big guy. He could have eaten me without salt and pepper. You know, and I looked at him and I said, Sheikh, I don't like your answer. I have to say this to you. I said, but Sheikh, I want to say something to you because you and I may never see each other again. I said, not far from here is a mountain. 5,000 years ago, a man you and I respect, Abraham, went up that mountain to express his faith in God, and to do that, he was offering his own son. He said, that's right. I said, let's not argue which son it was, or we'll get into a different argument here. I said, let's agree it was his son. He said, okay. I said, when he went up and that proverbial axe is about to fall, God stopped that arm. He said, that's right. I said, you know what God said? He said, no. I said, God said, stop. I myself will provide. He said, yeah, that's right. I said, Sheikh, very close to where you and I are sitting is a hill called Calvary. 2,000 years ago, God kept that promise. He took his own son up that hill. I said, Sheikh, this time the arm did not stop. I said, until you and I receive the son that God has provided for us, we'll be offering our own sons and daughters on the battlefields of this world for position, power, land, and prestige. There was pin drop silence in the room. The Archbishop said, I guess it's time to go. So walking away, I walked towards the staircase. I thought, brother, I've blown it big time. The Archbishop came and put his arm around me and he said, Ravi, thank you. He said, that was of God. I said, I sure hope so. I've never thought of that until just now. So we go down the steps, and the Archbishop being the guest of honor, the Sheikh went but he quickly hurried him into his car and ran towards where I was. I thought, that's it, finished. I'm going to be buried in Ramallah. He came over to me and he grabbed me by the shoulders. As you know, some of you may know, I have a back problem, got 2 metal rods after 2 major operations. He grabbed me by the shoulder and he looked me eyeball to eyeball. And he patted me on the face and kissed me on both sides of my face. He said, Mr. Zacharias, you're a good man. I hope I'll see you again someday. And I saw him wipe a tear away as he hugged me and helped me into my car. You know what? Jesus looked at his disciples when they tried to protect him with a sword. And he said, put that away. And he healed the man in his ear. He said to Pilate, my kingdom is not of this world, or my servants would fight to protect my arrest. My kingdom is from another place. Those in religion who have turned to abuse of violence in order to dominate the world have violated what Christ himself taught us. And I say to you, take a look at Jesus and not at Christendom, and ask yourself the question, what do I find wrong with him? Okay, take care. Yeah. You know what? Time is gone. We'll just take 2 more if we don't mind, and then we boys could hang around for a little while here, and if we can help you one-on-one, we'll do it. But we keep going. You know, we've got a lot of travel to do, and you may want to bury us here too. But we'll take 1 and 1, and let's go to it.
Hi, thank you very much for your lecture and for a number of moving stories. If the essence of God is to create and to realize the infinite potential for creation, that is his identity, and yet in the act of creating the world, he desired his children to somehow recapitulate his nature or to continue his work, would not the act of creation become an act of vanity?
An act of what? Vanity?
Vanity. Thank you.
Where are you from?
Ukraine.
Ukraine. Good. Would not creation itself have become an act of vanity for God to create?
Yeah, good question. I haven't thought about that in quite those terms very much, and that's a good question. I think maybe an analogy of human procreation is helpful, because it's one that we can sort of each get our heads around a bit. I think someone can procreate out of a desire to fulfill their own desires or to meet a certain need that they have. I'm going to have a child because that's going to fix my marriage, or that's going to give me a certain sort of identity or self-worth that I don't have. But I also think that there's a type of procreation where the motivation is actually just out of love for your future child. Not because of anything that you need, not because of anything that that child is going to do or earn or accomplish. Just the love of a parent just standing over a newborn child, just delighting in that child. Not because the child has done anything or earned anything, not thinking about how productive the child will be for the family business or how many awards they'll win at Princeton or anything like that. Just simply out of love for your child created in your image. And Christians call that grace, a type of love that is in no way dependent on what you can give to the lover, on what you're able to earn or deserve or merit or accomplish, but simply the love of a parent for a child. And I would say that that's why I think that God's creation is not an act of vanity, because it's not an act that he does because he needs something or because he's creating so that someone can deserve something and make him feel good about it, but he's creating simply out of that grace-type love of a parent for a child.
Does he want us to be like him?
Sorry, say again?
Does he want us to be like him? Does he want us to try to act as he would judge to be?
Yes, it's a good question. Does he want us to be like him? And I think the answer is yes. He doesn't expect us to be able to do that ourselves. And the Bible says that when you make a decision, a free decision to trust God, actually his Spirit comes to live inside of you in a real way. And you experience yourself being transformed from the inside out more into his likeness. But here's the thing. There's a great story in the Bible where God is pictured as a father, and one of his sons, he asks for his inheritance early. He goes off, he squanders the inheritance, he spends all of his time with prostitutes and just wasting the money that his father has worked his whole life to provide. And he realizes the error of his ways, and he comes back to the father, back to his home, and the father just takes off running towards the child. And in that culture, he would have had to hike up a long flowing robe. He would have had to expose his legs, which for an adult man in that culture would have been shameful. But he just took off running. And the son, I imagine, was just thinking, am I going to get hit? Why is he running towards me? And the father runs. He embraces him. He kisses him. He says, let's throw a party. He kills his best animal, and he throws his best party to welcome that son home. So yes, God does want us to be like him, but it's by his power and his Spirit that he helps us to be like him. And even when we go in the completely opposite direction, just like a good parent with their child, the love for the child is no different. The love for the child is not dependent on whether or not we are more like him or less like him. Thanks for that question.
I'll add one footnote to that. If I love somebody and that person refuses to love me, I hurt because I have lost something, right? Because I've lost something. Here, the issue of language becomes very critical. Language is used in three ways, said Aquinas: univocal, equivocal, analogical. Univocal is when you use a word in two different sentences and it means the same thing, all right? So I say, I love you, and I love somebody else out there. You're not pausing to evaluate the word. You assume it's the same thing. It's a univocal usage. If I take the word equivocally and I use the same word in different sentences, it means something different. If I say I'm a good tennis player, and then Roger Federer says he's a good tennis player, we still don't belong on the same court, because I wouldn't see the ball that's coming. His context for good is completely different to my context for good, because in my context, I first got to see the ball. In his, if he hit it my way, I doubt I'll even see it. But I use the same word. Sometimes we use words univocally, sometimes we use it equivocally, because it varies in the context. There's a third word, analogical. When I say I love you, and you refuse to love me, I hurt, because I've lost something. When God says he loves you, and you refuse to love God, God hurts too. God hurts not because he has lost something, but because you have lost something. The whole use of language in love and value, favor, comes to you in an analogy oftentimes. And you know, I've become a grandfather once last year and about to become a grandfather 2 more times. And today my daughter and son-in-law returned from Florence, Italy. They've just landed. I hadn't seen them for a month. I'm just longing to get back home so I can take that little guy and give him a big hug and squeeze all over again. My daughter said to me, what's the difference between parents and grandparents? Do you have any difference in feeling? I said, sweetheart, I'll tell you what, when you're a parent, all of your energy is expended in just taking care and worrying and providing for, you've got very little left to really enjoy it. Now when you're a grandparent, you do the worrying and you do the energizing, I'll take the enjoyment and I'll enjoy the little one. When you look at a young life and hold a little one in your arms, you have to ask yourself the question, what do you want for this child? Do you want it out of vanity? Or do you want it out of love and the supreme idea of what is life's purpose? Sometimes through suffering, sometimes through pain, sometimes through sacrifice. My prayer for that little boy is that he will always grow up to fulfill the law, the purpose that God has for him, and do it with honor and dignity. What path that will take, I don't know. God loves you for your sake and what's best for you, because nothing you do this way or that way will make him less than God, but what you do can make you less than what it means to be human. I'll leave that with you. We take the last one.
Hi, Ravi. When you say that atheists have no basis for morals, it seems that you're ignoring most of the existence of mankind, and that we can look at the world and see that peace leads to prosperity in nations.
Say that again, that what?
That peace leads to prosperity in nations. We can look and see objectively that trust and safety in communities allow art and science and technology to prosper. You attack atheists like Hitler and the lonely rich, but it seems like a bit of a stretch to think that all atheists search for happiness in murder, power, and cutthroat business. So it seems like you're attacking the weak nihilist who looks at the universe, sees that there's no ultimate moral authority, and leaves it at that. But you're ignoring the strong nihilists who look at the universe, see no ultimate moral authority, and say, this is an opportunity for us to use our reason, to use our experiences to create morals, to create the society that can best further us, that can create the happiest society. And so 2 questions. One, why is it fair to ignore these strong nihilists? And 2, isn't it more noble to use our own reason and experiences to form morals than put blind faith in an old, outdated text?
It's a good question, and I respect you for answering it. The thing that I oftentimes say to people who raise these questions to us and do so very legitimately is we think about these things too. We don't say there's no such thing as goodness in an atheistic world. That's not what we are saying at all. In fact, many, an extreme humanist could be a very, very good person, morally good. That is the question is not whether an atheist can be a good person or not. The question is there is no rationally irreducible extension of reason to do that except pragmatically that you want to live in peace, but that is assuming that peace is a good thing. That's only a matter of survival. If you are my neighbor and I want to be at peace with you, but you are not happy with the way I keep my lawn or what I do with my dog when the dog comes out of there, you're going to be a very angry person and want me to comport with the ground rules that you want to leave me with. And we are ultimately then forced to ask the question, what of the person who believes, as some people do, believe me, I have met them, who believe that the West is the greatest curse in the world today, who want to eradicate it, and then the world will be a better place. What is the grounds for us reasoning with that kind of person? Oh yeah, we all need to get along. He says, yeah, but I get along better when you're not around. That's exactly what they do. I'll give you now your question is not a foolish question, it's a very real question. I know many people who don't believe in God who are very decent living people, very good people. Sometimes I find their way of living is much more attractive oftentimes than some of the most hateful letters I ever get are from people who claim to be very devout Christians. I mean, they could just slice me down at the knees. And the moment I read the first paragraph, I can say, this person is going to claim to be a very godly person by the time this letter is over. And I can get some very kind letters from people like, you've raised your question in a very quiet way. But here's the question I raise for you. How do you adjudicate between two different moral frameworks that sit before you, each one of them believing that their goodness is superior to the other person's goodness? What happens today in the Middle East? You know what's happened in the Middle East for 5,000 years? One worldview lives with the philosophy and the logic of unforgiveness. It's a battle between two brothers, two half-brothers. The logic of unforgiveness. And so for 5,000 years now, blood's been let, blood's been spilt because there will never be forgiveness in there. Brother Andrew is a great man who's been to many parts of the world, a Palestinian young man who, by the way, in the same week I heard another, actually it was a previous visit, a young Palestinian person came up to me while I was in Jerusalem having some hummus and tabbouleh and all, enjoying conversation with him. And when I left, you know what he said to me? He said, I don't know if I'll see you again. I hope you do come. He said, well, I want to tell you something what our goal in life is. First, we will take care of Saturday, then we will take care of Sunday. Am I going to argue with him then? If I did, Sunday would be taken care of right then and there. So I had to leave. Brother Andrew was in a conversation, and a young Palestinian boy told me this story himself. He said, Brother Andrew was sitting across a sheikh's table in Jerusalem. And supposedly the story went that the Israelis had killed 4 Palestinians, and the Palestinians in revenge, under the sheikh's orders, went and killed 8 Israelis. So Brother Andrew leaned over and said, did you give that order? He said, yes. He said, can I ask you a question? Who made you the judge of everything in this world? He said, I'm not the judge. I'm only an instrument of God's justice. So this young Palestinian boy said, Brother Andrew looked at him and said, what then is the place for forgiveness? And he looked at Brother Andrew and said, that's only for those who deserve it. You know, if you deserve it, you're really not being forgiven, you've earned it. But you see the worldview coming through. The worldview is so deep-seated. If everybody had that natural inclination for peace and brotherhood and goodwill and so on, your question would be very pragmatically acceptable. But it's not the reality. The reality is the starting point is I and my worldview must be in control for millions of people today. For millions of people today. Yesterday I was in conversation with a man from a completely different worldview to mine. And my colleague, Matt, was with me in the car when he said this. He said, how do I respond to another person who is raising up his children with only one goal in life, to kill me? And I remembered being in Beirut, actually not in Beirut, in Sidon, where I met a man. And you know what he did every morning at sunrise? He took his 10-year-old boy, walked up, and he pointed to a distance, and he said, your goal in life is going to be to kill as many of those on the other side as on this. What do you say to him? I tell them that's not the answer. But the only reason I can tell them is because forgiveness is God's grace. The love of God places value on you. And if you really think about your questions seriously, you'll have to ask yourself this. How did we come to the conclusion, say the elimination of life in the womb, if your assumption from atheism is right, that we ought to live and live peaceably with each other? Life is too complex to take a simple principle like that and apply it for survival. It just has to assume what it means to be human and what kind of a moral ethic do we ultimately want living in this world. Your question is a good one. My answer to you is I've searched and searched and searched for years. I find no answer. Yes, can an atheist be a good person? but they're only living beyond what their own metaphysical assumptions actually are. And that's the way it ultimately boils down. Do you want to add? Let me just close with this. You've been very patient. I want to challenge you with this. For those of you who don't know Christ, I want you to give him some careful thought, serious thought. You don't have to take our word for it.